Hey, this is Jack Downs. A little video for those of you who missed class today, Tuesday, November 15th in 127. I know a couple of people are sick and so on, so I thought I'd make this for you to go over some of the content we did today. Let's, as usual, just take a quick look at the schedule as we begin. Remember, you can always see this on Moodle, and I'm going to share my screen now. You'll see that on Moodle. You should be seeing the Today, we went over more about persuasion and actually about reasoning. We did discuss the persuasive presentation itself, though, too. You should have a handout in your email from last week. You should go over that thoroughly to see about the persuasive presentation. If you haven't gotten me your persuasive topic, do it now. Remember, these should be concrete problems that you can see around you that you can suggest a solution for. So the persuasion is to say, hey, we have a problem. This is why it's serious. Maybe you could also say what causes it. There'd be problem cause or just problem solution. Problem cause solution or problem solution. So the problem, and then here's the solution or solutions. And then here's what you can do to help make it happen. So we're changing behavior. So look for a presentation you can do on a problem solution or problem cause solution, probably those choices topic. And you put that on Moodle right away because you should be preparing that. Also, do be reminded that there is regular practice today, Tuesday evening, and then tomorrow, Wednesday evening, here in Ward with the TAs. If you still need to practice your full informative, get over here and do it. Put it together, pull something together. You got to do that presentation, and then or perhaps you're thinking about getting extra credit by doing a poetry presentation. The reading from manuscript presentation, we had demos in class. I showed some stuff in class today, which examples on the screen, but you won't get to see those. But this would be something else you could practice to be ready to do as soon as next class. Either make up a presentations to get on track, or do a poetry presentation to get extra credit. What else does it say? It says work on study guide 3. Study guide 3 is, although it may have changed, I think, all the references in the schedule, but just in case there's any confusion, study guide 3 is due at the third exam, which is the second class after break. Break's coming up very soon, though, so it's time to get stuff done. Remember, you have to do all the presentations to pass this class. And these last two are the full informative and then the full persuasive. And the full persuasive will be given during the last two classes of the semester. So that's the schedule. You can look at that anytime. Now let's take a look at the homework, or what we went over today, what we did in class. Talked about reasoning. Now, if you're going to do a persuasive presentation, you have to argue for a change. You have to use reasoning. So how do you use reasoning? Well, I'm giving you here in this handout, which should be attached to the email, and I handed out in class today. There's 4 good reasoning techniques to use, right? And then each of these 4 have a way you could do them incorrectly. That is a fallacy. And then there are other fallacies, reasoning fallacies. In other words, faulty reasoning. So remember, reasoning is used the process of drawing conclusions based on evidence. The evidence comes from your research and from interviews, for instance, and you're going to use that both evidence and persuasion through reasoning, we hope, in your persuasive presentation. So we want to do sound ethical reasoning and to avoid reasoning fallacies or unethical reasoning ideas. There'll be kind of tricks for people too. So the first one would be inductive reasoning, which we also call, these are in your textbook generally, although I have a few extras here, we also call reasoning from specific instance. The idea is you have a number of small facts you've drawn, you've noticed, and you've drawn them together and draw a conclusion from them. So, for example, I could say, I picked up my neighbor's cat and I started to sneeze. I looked at cats at the pet store and I started to sneeze. Therefore, all cats make me sneeze, and I must be allergic to cats. Okay, so I've had one small instance, specific instance, another specific instance, and I draw a conclusion from them that I'm allergic to cats. I probably should have more data points than that to draw that conclusion, but you can see how it works. Take little things and ball them together to a big idea. Or I could say, my roommate likes this class, my best friend likes this class, therefore I think I will like this class. So if we had data points. Now, done poorly, this results in a hasty generalization. Hasty generalization fallacy. Now let's scroll down to that. Hasty generalization is what we suggest you jump to conclusion based on too few examples or examples that are exceptions or not good examples. So if I said, my brother eats nothing but pizza and French fries, never gets sick, and my uncle eats nothing but pizza and French fries and never gets sick, therefore I could eat the same and be healthy. Well, those would be examples that were exceptions. You know, most people who just ate that would get sick. Or I could say, last week we had 5 COVID cases on campus. This week we have 10 COVID cases on campus. Therefore, students aren't taking the pandemic seriously. Well, those are just 2 data points, not enough to make that conclusion at all. You have to know a lot more evidence than that to draw that conclusion. That'd be a hasty generalization. So we go back again. Deductive reasoning is the next one. So if inductive takes little items and puts them together to make a draw conclusion, deductive is kind of the opposite. Deductive, we start with a general principle, a big idea, and we move to a minor premise, and we end up with a specific conclusion. So both the general principle and the minor premise may need evidence. And if there's a problem with either of those, the whole thing falls apart. The whole thing could fall apart. Could be because of something called a non sequitur or something called a false principle, which are related but different. But they are the fallacies that could be when you poorly do deductive reasoning from principle. So, for instance, I could say that every time I fly that airline, I arrive late. That's the general principle. Okay. Then I could say, well, the premise would be, I'm flying an airline tomorrow, and I will say, therefore, I will be late. So if you assume the first one is correct, and I have to have a lot of examples of flying a lot of times on the airline to make that correct, every time I'm late, then you say I am flying that tomorrow, says that wouldn't require much evidence to say that I am flying, and therefore I'm late. I will be late. All mammals need water to survive. Okay, I think we all agree on that general principle. I'm a mammal, therefore I need water to survive. That would be deductive reasoning. So, what else? What's the fallacy here? The improper use of this idea, non sequitur and false principle. Non sequitur is a statement that means it's just does not follow. Non sequitur is a Latin phrase. It means it does not follow. In other words, one thing doesn't logically follow another. Non sequitur in common use usually means an almost comical thing that doesn't match at all. It'd be like saying, did you walk to school today or did you bring your lunch? You know, those things don't match up. It's a non sequitur when ideas in conversation don't match up. So that'd be one possible problem with that kind of a deductive reasoning. Another one would be a false cause. So, for instance, an example might be, think about every time, if I said, every time the rooster crows, the sun comes up. Therefore, the rooster is causing the sun to come. Oh, that's actually not quite right. Let me go back, do it again. Let's say, use this example here, okay? How about the United States is a country where anyone can succeed. You live in the United States, but you haven't succeeded, therefore it's your fault. Okay, so the general principle is the United States is a country where anyone can succeed. I don't think that's true, probably, right? That's where the error lies. It's in the general principle, all right? So it is a false principle. Yes, you live in America, and maybe you hadn't succeeded, but in this example, we were saying someone who has not. But the first principle is a false one. I think you could argue there's plenty of people who don't succeed in America, and it is not their fault. So therefore, a false principle throws the entire argument off. Let's go now to the next one, which is causal reasoning. This is pretty basic and is likely one of the most commonly used kinds of reasoning. It's just this thing causes that thing, all right? Cause and effect. So, for instance, in causal reasoning, I could say the doorbell rang, the dog barked, the doorbell ring caused the dog to bark. One thing happened, another thing happened. I can see they're linked, therefore one caused the other. 3 people ate tuna, 3 people ate chicken. The people who ate chicken got sick, therefore the chicken made us sick. Okay, so we eat something, we get sick, we blame it, what we ate. That's pretty basic. How about the idea about how could this be screwed up? Well, of course, the problem is 2 things that happen one after another doesn't mean one always caused the other. And in fact, this is the false cause fallacy, which is also called post hoc ergo propter hoc. Sometimes you'll hear people just say post hoc. It's a post hoc argument. Post hoc ergo propter hoc means after this, therefore because of this, which is not always true. Because just because something happens after doesn't mean it was caused by that first thing. It could be a coincidence. The problem here is that when one event follows another, those events aren't necessarily linked as cause and effect. So, as an example of a false cause, I could say, every time, this is the one I was trying to use before, every time the rooster crows, the sun comes up, therefore the rooster crowing must cause the sun to come up, which means that rooster is super powerful. No, they just, one happens and the other happens, and they're not linked by one causing the other. Well, except maybe the other way around. Or you could think about superstitions. When baseball players have a really good, a pitcher might have a really good game and might decide it's because he forgot to, he didn't have any clean socks, he wore dirty socks, he had a really good game this time. Therefore, he'll probably wear dirty socks every time to have a really good game. So superstitions are usually caused through the false cause fallacy. That's where superstitions usually come from. And finally, analogical, or reasoning by analogy, is comparing 2 situations and arguing that if it's true for one, it should be true for the other. Alternatively, you can go backwards on this using comparative advantage structure. And we could say we have 2 solutions, all right, but one works in one place, but it may not work here, though, because maybe our places are not analogy. Maybe things are too different. So we can use this to both argue that one thing happens here and therefore it can happen here also, or you could turn it around and say, because it happened there, but that's a very different place or a very different society or something, therefore it wouldn't happen here. So it all comes down to how good your analogy is, right? So the example of analogical reasoning might be, we could say, hey, students at SUNY Potsdam get to have emotional support animals in their dorms, and there's no problem, it works well. Therefore, SUNY Plattsburgh is similar enough that we ought to be able to do the same here without any problems. Maybe they're somewhat similar, pretty similar. Maybe that's a good argument. Actually, I don't know if that's true about the emotional support animals, but that's an example of drawing an analogy between 2 colleges, and one does one thing, therefore it should work at the other one, for instance. I could say an example in your textbook, you could make the argument that Japan and Great Britain are very similar to the United States, and that they're modern industrial societies, yet they don't have much violent crime. Therefore, and because of their anti-gun laws. Therefore, if it works there, it should work here. Anti-gun laws here would help us to not have as much violent crime. But you could turn that around and say that actually Japan and Great Britain are very different societies than us. Therefore, it's not a good comparison, a good analogy. And that's what the invalid analogy idea is. Invalid analogy is when 2 cases that are being compared are not similar enough. So an example of invalid analogy might be, we said, if Great Britain, this is from your textbook actually, if Great Britain can elect a prime minister in a campaign that lasts only a month, well, surely the United States ought to be able to do the same thing in the race for president. Well, no, our political systems are extremely different. It's not going to work the same. So therefore, it's an invalid analogy. You could say lots of people need a cup of coffee in the morning to properly function. In the same way, we shouldn't be troubled by alcoholics who need a drink in the morning to get going. I don't think those are the same thing, really. That does not seem like a good analogy to me. So invalid analogy. Now, the rest of these are just fallacies, but they're good ones to know. The idea of bandwagon is saying everybody's doing it, therefore it's okay. Polls show the majority of Americans are okay with torturing terrorists to get information that might stop future attacks, which proves that's a good policy. Just because everybody agrees with it doesn't mean it's a good thing. All right. That's called getting on the bandwagon. It's about popularity. Red herring, the idea of a red herring is it's something unusual. It's a fanciful fish, right? It's going to catch attention. Using a red herring argument is intentionally introducing your unrelated, irrelevant issue to divert attention and distract. Example might be if I was in a political campaign and somebody accused me of saying that I have shirked my saying about me, that I've shirked my responsibilities, I've missed out on votes, I failed to attend committee meetings, and all the things I've done wrong in the office. And then they turned around and said, and then I would turn around and argue against them. I would say, how dare you suggest I've shirked my responsibilities at a time when we're facing the challenge of the COVID pandemic? What's the COVID pandemic got to do with it? Nothing. In fact, that's the basis of this fallacy. It's that what's it got to do with it? It doesn't have anything to do with it. It's an attempt to distract. This is distracting with intentionally irrelevant information, as opposed to the next one, which is an ad hominem attack, which means against the man, which means a personal attack, which is an attack on the person to distract again from the real issue. Guys in that same campaign or political debate, and that same other candidate said those things about me. And now I turn around and said something like, how dare he say those things about me when he beats his wife and abuses his kids and kicks his dog? Well, that's got nothing to do with the issue of the things that he said. And besides, it's probably all not true, but it's an attempt to distract by making it a personal attack on the other person, distract from the issues that were raised. Either or arguments, which is also called a false dilemma. The idea is when we say that there's only two choices, and one of them is obviously the choice we want people to pick because we think it sounds so much better. When we're in the real world, there are so many more choices for answers to things, right? So an example would be, and this is the kind of thing we use in relationships sometimes, personal relationships, it's kind of a false argument, bad reasoning. We could say to your parents, you might say, so you won't buy me that computer right now? I guess that means what you're saying is you don't care about my education. Well, those are not the only two choices. Buy the computer right now or don't care about your education. You know, there's more choices than that. So, or we could say, a candidate might say, we need to increase spending on police and or face a rising tide of dangerous crime. Are those the only two choices? Spend money on police or face rising crime? I doubt those are the only two choices. I bet you there's more nuance than that. So we create this false dilemma. Slippery slope is the idea that there's a just one little action that you take that you're opposing probably, right? It's going to cause a cascade of failure of other problems. I said the idea that this is usually used against in arguing against something. If I wanted to argue against the idea of building low-income housing in my neighborhood, I might say building low-income housing in my neighborhood will make it less desirable to wealthy home buyers, which means that the value of our homes will decrease, which means people will abandon their homes, default on their mortgages, which will bring a collapse to the neighborhood. It's a slippery slope. It's one thing cause another. But there's no evidence for it. And it's probably very unlikely anyway that all those things would happen in order. Appeal to tradition is just the idea that we've always done it, therefore it's the right thing to do, which is not good reasoning. Remember your textbook? It says the Electoral College has been around since 1789. If it was good enough for George Washington, it's good enough for me. Just because we've always done it doesn't mean it's right. Likewise, though, just because something is new doesn't mean it's right. We have appeals to novelty all the time. In advertising, for instance, when we're always talking about the new gimmick, the new trend, the new thing, people want to want to sell it to you because it's new. Doesn't mean it's better. Doesn't mean it's worth getting, right? You need evidence about one action is better than another rather than just because it's new. A straw man, and I don't think this one is in your text, is the idea of arguing that you're making an argument, but you're not arguing against the other person's point or position. You've created a different point or position, and that's the one you're arguing against. And so in other words, you're suggesting that the person probably is much more extreme than they are. Often used in politics, you exaggerate or distort the opponent's position, and you attack that position, that straw man, that fictional position, fictional person, rather than the real person who's right there. So, for instance, if I wanted to suggest more tutoring and better study guides would help students, maybe that's an argument I'm making, and someone opposing me would say something like, "If you commit this, sorry, if you we shouldn't be handing out A's to students who don't want to do the work." I didn't say anything about handing out A's to students who didn't want to do the work. That wasn't my argument, but that's what you're arguing against. You created this kind of fictional person, a straw man, and you're arguing against them, making it seem like it's really me. So those are some reasoning fallacies to pay attention to. And also you'll find attached to this email this little handout, which is asking you to type to list what you think the answers are. What do you think, for instance, these first four, which I will suggest to you are similar to the first four in your handout, what reasoning is being attempted, and then do you think it actually is done well, or do you think it falls into the world of fallacy that's connected to that type of reasoning? And the last ones are all just fallacies, and hopefully you can come up with the fallacies that they are related to from the list also. So if you want to do those and you want to write them out and then ask me about them, I can give you the answers another time. So that would be something good for you to try on your own to practice, because there'll be some of this stuff on the exam. All right, that's about it for the video. I hope it helps, and I hope to see you in class soon. And please be ready to do your full informative if you haven't done it yet. And please be ready to do perhaps a poetry presentation in these next 2 days of classes. And then finally, please be working on your persuasive presentation. Oops, hold on just a second. I just stop my share, and that will be the end.